The train screamed against the evening rails, cutting through the orange blur of autumn woods. Margaret Hale sat by the window, her gloved hands folded in her lap, staring at the reflection of a woman she barely recognized. 2 years a widow, and still, the world felt quieter than any graveyard. Then, as the train jolted through a tunnel, she saw him, across the aisle, in the half-shadow. A man in a dark coat, silver hair catching the last ray of sun, watching her with kind, distant eyes. He smiled, as if he had been waiting. "You take this train often, don't you?" he said, voice deep, soft, almost echoing. Margaret hesitated. She could swear, for a heartbeat, his reflection wasn't in the window at all. The train groaned along the rusted tracks, a long metallic sigh that seemed to echo the ache in Margaret Hale's chest. She adjusted her scarf against the late autumn chill and settled into her usual window seat, the one she had claimed every Friday for the last 2 years. Through the glass, a blur of orange and brown swept past, fallen leaves chased by the wind, trees stripped bare against a gray sky. This train had become her ritual. Every Friday, at exactly 4:15 p.m., she boarded the same nearly empty local train that rattled from her quiet town to the end of the line, a small rural station with nothing but a dirt path leading to the cemetery where her husband rested. 2 years since the heart attack had taken him, and still the world felt thinner. The silence at home was the worst, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of the old kitchen clock. She folded her gloved hands on her lap and closed her eyes for a moment. The train swayed and hummed, a melancholy lullaby. For a few stops, she was alone in the carriage, save for the flickering fluorescent light above her and the distant murmur of the conductor in the next car. Then, when the train slowed by the forest curve, she felt it. Someone watching her. Margaret opened her eyes. Across the aisle, a man now sat opposite her, as if he had always been there. He was in his early 60s perhaps, with silver hair combed neatly back and a dark wool coat that looked almost formal for such a sleepy town. He held a small leather satchel on his knee and met her gaze with a soft, polite smile. "You take this train often, don't you?" His voice was deep, warm, carrying the gentleness of someone who didn't want to startle a stray bird. Margaret hesitated. She could swear, for a heartbeat, his reflection wasn't in the window at all. The train groaned along the rusted tracks, a long metallic sigh that seemed to echo the ache in Margaret Hale's chest. She adjusted her scarf against the late autumn chill and settled into her usual window seat, the one she had claimed every Friday for the last 2 years. Through the glass, a blur of orange and brown swept past, fallen leaves chased by the wind, trees stripped bare against a gray sky. This train had become her ritual. Every Friday at exactly 4:15 p.m., she boarded the same nearly empty local train that rattled from her quiet town to the end of the line, a small rural station with nothing but a dirt path leading to the cemetery where her husband rested. 2 years since the heart attack had taken him, and still the world felt thinner. The silence at home was the worst, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of the old kitchen clock. She folded her gloved hands on her lap and closed her eyes for a moment. The train swayed and hummed, a melancholy lullaby. For a few stops, she was alone in the carriage, save for the flickering fluorescent light above her and the distant murmur of the conductor in the next car. Then, when the train slowed by the forest curve, she felt it, someone watching her. Margaret opened her eyes. Across the aisle, a man now sat opposite her, as if he had always been there. He was in his early 60s perhaps, with silver hair combed neatly back and a dark wool coat that looked almost formal for such a sleepy town. He held a small leather satchel on his knee and met her gaze with a soft, polite smile. "You take this train often, don't you?" His voice was deep, warm, carrying the gentleness of someone who didn't want to startle a stray bird. Margaret hesitated. She could swear, for a heartbeat, his reflection wasn't in the window at all. The train screeched into the final station. The sky had dipped into a deepening dusk. Margaret gathered her coat and purse. She hesitated, unsure if she should say goodbye, but he only offered a polite nod, the kind that strangers give when they will probably meet again. Margaret stepped off the train, her shoes crunching the gravel, and the evening air bit at her cheeks. Behind her, the doors closed with a hiss, and the train groaned to life. rolling away into the horizon. She paused on the empty platform, a peculiar warmth lingering in her chest. Strange, I almost felt accompanied. The next Friday, Margaret hesitated for a moment at the station. A part of her wondered if last week had been nothing more than a peculiar dream, a trick of loneliness and the swaying train. She had almost convinced herself of it until she climbed into the same near-empty carriage and saw him. There he was. Same seat, same dark coat, that same warm smile that seemed to soften the cold edges of late autumn. "Good afternoon," he said, as if they'd known each other for years. Margaret felt something stir in her chest, a small, unfamiliar flutter. She nodded. "Good afternoon." She settled into her seat by the window, and the train shuddered forward, leaving the little town behind. This time, conversation came easier. He asked about the things she liked about the ride. She admitted she liked the forest stretch best, where the trees turned to fire every autumn. He smiled at that, glancing out the window as the blur of crimson and gold rushed by. "I love this part," he said softly. "The world looks almost alive, like it's breathing." Margaret followed his gaze. The sunlight slipped through branches, strobing across their faces. The rhythm of the train and the rustle of leaves outside became a single song. "I used to love that sound too." He tilted his head as the wheels clacked against the rails. "It takes me back to simpler days." She studied his face quietly. His voice carried an old melancholy, like the echo of a hymn in an empty chapel. And his eyes, kind, deep, almost luminous in the dim light, held a softness that felt like a conversation on its own. When the train slowed near a bend, he turned to her with a question. "Is someone waiting for you at the last stop?" The words landed gently, but Margaret felt her throat tighten. She shook her head faintly. "No, my husband passed away 2 years ago. I visit him at the cemetery." For the first time, the man's smile faltered. His gaze drifted to the floor, and a shadow passed across his expression. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and in that moment, Margaret thought she saw something behind his eyes, a sorrow she couldn't name, heavy and old. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the train rocking them gently. A few stops before the end of the line, the conductor strolled down the aisle, punching tickets. He gave Margaret a nod and a polite "Evening, ma'am." Then he walked right past the man in the dark coat. Didn't even glance at him. Margaret blinked, her mouth half open, but said nothing. Perhaps he had a monthly pass, she reasoned, or the conductors simply knew him. She took that thought away, but it stayed with her like a pebble in her shoe. When the train finally wheezed into the last station, the sky was turning lavender with the first hint of evening. Thomas, she still didn't know his name, not yet, gave her a soft nod, the kind that was almost a farewell, but not quite. Margaret stepped off the train and started down the path toward the cemetery, the chilly wind tugging at her scarf. But all the way home, even as she sat alone in her kitchen with a lukewarm cup of tea, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind on that train, a memory that wasn't hers, a longing that had been quietly, almost imperceptibly handed to her. And somewhere deep in her chest, a fragile, unfamiliar ache had bloomed, a longing for the man with the kind eyes. The third Friday was colder, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones, even under Margaret's long wool coat and scarf. The train station smelled of iron and wet leaves, and the low sun cast thin golden light across the deserted platform. She hugged herself, shivering slightly, and wondered if she was being foolish. It had been a long time since she'd felt anticipation like this, the kind that made her check the platform as if she were expecting someone. But she couldn't help it. She had thought about him all week, the man with the kind eyes. When the train arrived with its familiar groan of metal on metal, she stepped into the near-empty carriage and felt her chest bloom with a quiet warmth. He was there. Same seat, same coat. This time, he was holding 2 paper cups, steam curling from the lids. "I thought," he said, his voice carrying a soft cheer that warmed her more than the heating ever could. "Every journey is warmer with a little coffee." He held one out to her. Margaret hesitated for a heartbeat, then accepted. The cup was hot in her gloved hands, and she smiled despite herself. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." "Kindness makes trains shorter," he said, grinning with a playful lens that seemed to belong to someone younger than his silver hair suggested. They sat like that for a while, sipping coffee, the rhythmic clack of the train filling the spaces between words. The brew was stronger than she usually drank, with a smoky undertone that lingered on her tongue. She thought of how long it had been since someone had done a small, thoughtful thing for her with no reason but to share a moment. The conversation began tentatively, like leaves stirring in a breeze, and then flowed more easily than she expected. He spoke about the way the landscape always changed this time of year, how the fiery leaves along the tracks seemed to set the world alight. "Autumn is the season that remembers the most," he said, looking out at the blur of colors. Margaret nodded, staring at her own reflection in the window. "I suppose I like autumn because it doesn't hide the ending. Everything else tries to pretend it will last forever." He chuckled softly, and she noticed for the first time that he had dimples, the kind that only appeared when his smile was truly sincere. At one point, the train passed over the river, and the light shimmered off the water. Margaret followed his gaze to the reflection, wondering if this was the part of the journey he loved most. He didn't say anything for a while, and the silence between them felt companionable, like 2 people sharing a quiet secret. Then he broke the silence. "I used to love someone very much," he said, his voice lower now, thoughtful. "I thought we were going to spend the rest of our lives together." Margaret held the cup closer, its warmth now almost a shield against the cold creeping into her heart. "What happened?" He looked down at his coffee, turning the cup slowly between his palms. "I couldn't keep her. Life got in the way. Choices, mistakes. I guess sometimes love isn't enough to keep someone beside you." Margaret swallowed hard. She thought of her husband, of the hospital room with its relentless beeping and white sheets. She thought of the years of shared silence, the arguments that had faded into habit, and the last quiet weeks when words had become almost unnecessary. "I'm sorry," she said softly, though she wasn't sure which of them she was speaking for. He smiled again, a little sadder this time. "Life is full of stations. Sometimes people just get off before we're ready to say goodbye." The train rattled on, its rhythm like a slow heartbeat. As they talked, Margaret noticed little things about him that made her chest tighten in ways she hadn't expected. The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the measured way he spoke, and the gentleness of his hands as he gestured. There was a gravity to him, like a man who had carried years of longing without complaint. For a moment, she imagined what it might be like to see him outside the confines of this carriage, walking beside him on the beach, sitting across from him at a small cafe, sharing real porcelain cups instead of paper ones. That flicker of hope both warmed and frightened her. The train began to slow as it approached the final station. The gray light outside had softened into the pale lavender of early evening. Margaret felt a familiar pang of reluctance. She didn't want the ride to end. As the brakes hissed and the train squealed to a stop, Thomas, she still hadn't dared ask his name out loud, but in her heart it was already his, stood up gracefully and gave a small old-fashioned bow. "Until Friday," he said, voice smooth as a promise. Margaret blinked, startled by the formality of it, but managed a small nod. "Until Friday." He stepped down the aisle, his long coat swaying slightly, and disappeared into the dim light of the station corridor. She watched him go until he was swallowed by the crowd, or perhaps by the shadows. It wasn't until she rose to leave that she noticed it. His paper coffee cup still sat on the small table between the seats. Steam curled lazily from the opening. It was still warm. That night, Margaret placed the empty cup on her kitchen table as if it were a relic. She traced the rim of her finger and felt something ache deep inside her. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this. Simple gestures, shared warmth, and the feeling that someone might see her more than a quiet widow riding a lonely train. She went to bed with a strange, tender thought circling in her mind. Maybe life is giving me a second spring. The fourth Friday arrived wrapped in a soft drizzle, the kind that painted the station windows with silver streaks. Margaret clutched her umbrella and stepped onto the platform, her heart tapping a gentle, anticipatory rhythm against her ribs. She had tried all week not to hope too much. After all, she told herself, it was just a chance meeting, a small ritual of the train ride, nothing more. But when she stepped into the quiet carriage, she saw him, Thomas. He sat in the same seat, his coat neatly buttoned, his silver hair catching the weak afternoon light. He looked up and smiled with that warmth that seemed to seep past the damp air and settle into her chest. "You came," he said softly, as if he doubted it. "Of course," she replied, tucking a damp strand of hair behind her ear. He chuckled at that, and for a few minutes they spoke of small things, the stubborn weather, the way the fields had turned from amber to muted brown, and how the river below the bridge now carried the memory of autumn leaves. The conversation was comfortable, almost familiar now, as though they were continuing a thread spun over many lifetimes instead of a handful of train rides. Then Thomas grew quiet. He shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers tracing the seam of his coat. Margaret noticed the hesitation and tilted her head. "Something on your mind?" she asked. He inhaled deeply, as if bracing himself against a sudden wind. Then in that careful, measured voice of his, he said, "Would you like to meet for lunch next Friday at the little cafe near the station? Willow and Steam, I think it's called." For a moment, the train and the world seemed to still. Margaret blinked. The cafe. She knew it well. She used to go there with her husband back when there was still a we. It had been years since she'd stepped inside. Her heart fluttered like the pages of a book caught in a breeze. She hesitated, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. 63, she thought. 63, and here I am, blushing like a schoolgirl. Thomas waited patiently, his kind eyes fixed on hers with a gentleness that made it hard to breathe. "Yes," she said at last. The word was small, but it felt like a spark in a long, darkened room. "Next Friday, 11? He smiled, slow, genuine, the sort of smile that seemed to carry both gratitude and something older, something wistful. 11 it is." The train swayed, carrying them toward the last stop. Margaret could feel her pulse in her fingertips, a mixture of nervousness and a fragile joy that she hadn't expected to feel again in this lifetime. When the brakes hissed and the carriage jolted to a stop, Thomas didn't rise right away. He stayed seated for a heartbeat longer than usual, watching her in a way that made her breath catch. There was something in his gaze, soft, distant, and oddly final, a look that felt less like, "See you soon," and more like farewell, just in case. He finally stood and gave a small nod, his voice quieter than usual. "Until next week." She stepped off the train into the cool air, turning once to glance back. Through the window he was still watching her. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw him framed by the dim light of the carriage, like a photograph faded by time. Then the train door closed with a sigh, and he was gone. At home, Margaret went straight to her small bedroom, peeled off her damp coat, and caught sight of herself in the mirror. She froze. She was smiling. A soft, involuntary curve at the corners of her lips, the kind she hadn't seen since before the heart monitor in the hospital room had gone flat, since before she had become the quiet widow, moving through days like pages turning in a book no one was reading. She touched her reflection lightly, as if confirming that it was truly her. "It feels like life is giving me a second spring," she thought, and for the first time in 2 years, she let that feeling stay.
The rain had stopped during the night, leaving the streets of the small town slick and shining beneath the pale morning sun. Margaret walked down Main Street with her scarf snug around her neck, the soft thud of her shoes muffled by the lingering dampness on the pavement. It was a quiet Friday, the kind that carried an expectant stillness, as if the day itself was holding its breath for her. She reached Willow and Steam Cafe 10 minutes early. The little bell above the door chimed as she entered. Warm air filled with the scent of roasted coffee beans wrapped around her, a comforting cocoon against the cool autumn outside. The cafe looked just as she remembered it. The worn wooden floors, the mismatched chairs, the potted plant leaning toward the sunlight in the window. And there, by the window, was their table. Small, round, its surface catching the soft daylight. Empty. Margaret sat down, her fingers smoothing the edge of the menu, though she didn't need to read it. She ordered a cup of tea, not coffee. Coffee felt too much like him. She imagined Thomas stepping in any moment, holding his own steaming cup, smiling that quiet, knowing smile. 30 minutes passed. Every time the bell above the door chimed, her heart leapt, only to fall again when it was a young couple, or an old man with a newspaper, or a delivery driver with a cart of milk. She sipped her tea slowly, the warmth spreading through her chest in place of the nervous energy fluttering there. She tapped her fingers against the ceramic cup, glancing toward the window. She wanted to believe he was just running late. An hour passed. The steam from her cup had thinned, and the tea had gone lukewarm. Margaret checked the small silver watch on her wrist, a gift from her late husband. 11 had come and gone. Noon approached, and still, no familiar figure darkened the doorway. Her chest tightened with something she didn't want to name. A part of her clung stubbornly to hope. He would walk in, apologize, explain everything. Maybe his car had trouble. Maybe he had forgotten his phone. Maybe... She stopped herself. She didn't even know if Thomas owned a car or a phone. 2 hours passed. The cafe grew louder with lunchtime chatter, and Margaret felt herself shrinking, a small, invisible figure tucked against the window as the world carried on without noticing her. She caught the sympathetic glance of the young barista as he cleared away her cold tea. "Would you like another cup?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "No, thank you." Her voice sounded thinner than she expected. She rose to leave, her body heavy with a strange combination of shame and dread. It wasn't just disappointment. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at the edges of her mind like the sharp cold air waiting outside the cafe door. That afternoon, Margaret returned to the train. She needed the ritual. The train, at least, was dependable. She stepped onto the near-empty carriage at 4:15 p.m., the familiar hum of the engine rising beneath her feet. The seat across from hers, his seat, was empty. She told herself not to look for him, but her eyes kept flicking to the window, to the reflections in the glass as the train shuddered and began to move. Her reflection stared back, a small, pale woman in a gray scarf, alone. The train wound through the familiar woods and fields, the world blurring into autumn colors. The clatter of the wheels was her only companion, filling the gaps where his voice should have been. When the train slowed for the first small station, she felt a sudden surge of hope, a foolish, desperate flutter. Through the window, on the platform, she swore she saw him. Thomas. He was standing just beyond the yellow line, hat tilted against the wind, watching the train. Margaret's heart lurched. She rose from her seat, fumbling with her bag, stumbling toward the door. the doors slid open with a hiss, and she stepped down onto the platform, scanning for him. "Thomas?" she called softly. A gust of wind tore her voice away. The platform was empty. Margaret turned in a slow circle, her breath visible in the cooling air. No hat, no coat, no trace of the man she thought she saw. Just the long, lonely stretch of railway cutting through the trees, the station clock ticking in indifference. The train doors beeped. She climbed back on board, her chest hollow. By the time the train rolled into the last stop, her hope had twisted into something heavier, an uneasy fear that pressed down on her ribs. She walked to the cemetery as she always did, the gray stones lining the path like silent witnesses. Standing before her husband's grave, she whispered, more to herself than to the cold air, "Did I imagine him?" The wind stirred the dry leaves around her feet, offering no answer.
The following Friday, the air had the brittle sharpness of late autumn. Margaret pulled her scarf tighter as she stepped onto the familiar platform at 4:15 p.m. The train was already waiting, engine humming softly in the cooling dusk. She boarded, the rhythm of her feet echoing against the nearly empty carriage. Habit carried her to the same seat, her seat. Across the aisle, the opposite seat, his seat, waited. Empty. She placed her handbag on her lap and stared at the upholstery, tracing the worn threads with her eyes as the train began to move. Her chest ached with a blend of hope and dread, like she was bracing herself for a truth she didn't want to face. After the first few minutes, the conductor passed through the car, his brass buttons glinting in the weak light. Margaret hesitated before speaking, her voice timid but steady. "Excuse me, sir." The man stopped, polite and patient. "Yes, ma'am." "There's usually a gentleman who rides this train, tall with salt and pepper hair, always wears a dark coat. He sits right there." She gestured to the empty seat. "Do you know him?" The conductor's brow furrowed. He glanced at the seat, then back at her. "Ma'am, I've been working this route for 20 years. I don't think I've ever seen a man like that." Margaret blinked. No, that can't be right. I've spoken to him several times. He brings coffee." The conductor offered a polite, uncertain smile, the kind people give when they don't want to alarm someone. "I'm sorry, I think you might be mistaken." He moved on, leaving Margaret frozen in her seat, her heart knocking against her ribs. She gripped her handbag tight, knuckles pale. The train rattled through the forest and fields, but the sound of the tracks felt colder now, emptier. She didn't bother looking at the reflection in the window anymore. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to see him. That evening, Margaret went home and headed straight for the attic. Dust rose in soft clouds as she pulled open the old wooden chest where she kept her husband's belongings. Photographs, ticket stubs, brittle letters yellowed with time. She hadn't opened it in months. Her fingers trembled as she dug through the artifacts of a life shared and a love lost. And then, near the bottom, beneath a stack of newspapers and a faded train timetable, she found it. A newspaper clipping. The headline was brief and somber. "Man dies in apparent suicide on local rail line 10 years ago today." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes fell to the small, grainy, black and white photograph beneath the headline. The face was faint, blurred with the poor quality of print and age, but she would have known those kind eyes anywhere. Thomas.
The same soft smile, the same sorrowful gaze she'd come to recognize, to anticipate, to... Margaret dropped to her knees, the clipping trembling in her hands. Her chest felt hollow, a yawning space where warmth used to be. She stumbled to her bedroom and fumbled with the old cassette recorder on her nightstand. Her voice shook as she pressed the red button. "I think I fell in love with a ghost." The tape whirred softly, catching her whisper as the wind outside the window rattled like distant, mournful applause.
The next Friday arrived with the soft ache of inevitability. Margaret woke before dawn, the pale gray light of morning leaking through her curtains. She dressed slowly, the ritual now as familiar as breathing. A wool skirt, the burgundy cardigan with frayed cuffs, the scarf her husband had given her on their last anniversary together. She brushed her hair with care, the same way she had done every week since she began these journeys, as if she were preparing to see someone she loved. The air outside carried the brittle scent of late autumn, damp leaves, distant wood smoke, and the sharpness of winter waiting just beyond the horizon. The sky was a heavy pewter color, but the town was quiet, still dozing as she walked the familiar path to the station. The platform was nearly empty, as always. She arrived 5 minutes before the 4:15 train, as she always did. The air vibrated faintly with the rumble of the approaching engine, a heartbeat she had memorized. The train slid into the station, its wheels squealing, and Margaret climbed the steps into the first car. The car was nearly empty, a landscape of silence punctuated by the occasional sway of a loose right fixture. She made her way down the aisle, her footsteps muffled against the worn carpet, and stopped at her seat, the seat she had claimed in ritual, week after week. She sat down, smoothing her skirt, placing her handbag carefully on the bench beside her. Across from her, the seat was empty. It didn't matter. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids, she summoned him. She could see him as clearly as if he were really there. Thomas, in his dark coat, his salt and pepper hair gently mussed by some imagined breeze, his hands folded over his lap, posture polite and old-fashioned, as if he had been born to sit on trains and offer quiet company to lonely widows. In her mind, he smiled the way he always did, warm, gentle, touched with melancholy. Those kind eyes met hers across the narrow table. The train lurched forward, pulling them toward the familiar route, the forest painted in muted oranges and reds, the open fields that would soon sleep under winter's frost, and the winding track that hugged the edge of the world as it neared the cemetery where her husband slept beneath a modest headstone. She leaned forward, her hands cupping an invisible coffee cup. "I forgive you, and I miss you." The words floated into the still air of the train, unheard by anyone but the phantom in her mind. She didn't know if she was forgiving Thomas for leaving or herself for holding on to him even after she knew the truth. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. The forgiveness was a shape in the air, a kind of peace she could finally hold without closing her fist around it. The train rattled on. Outside the window, the forest thickened. Bare branches scraped against the wind, their leaves long fallen and now matted in the damp earth. A streak of light caught on the glass, and for a split second, she thought she saw his reflection there, a man seated across from her, his shape faint, half swallowed by shadow. Her heart ached, but not with fear. She blinked slowly and spoke again, voice barely louder than the hum of the train. "I thank you for keeping me company, Thomas, even if you were only ever passing through." The train curved along Ocean Cliff Drive, the place she had once learned the truth of his story. The ocean stretched far below, a smear of steel gray, churning under the breath of the cold November wind. She thought of that night,
10 years ago, of headlights cutting through rain and the fragile line between life and whatever comes after. A tear rolled down her cheek. Not grief this time, something softer, like the release of a long-held breath. She stayed like that for the rest of the journey, eyes closed, heart open, letting the rhythm of the wheels lull her into the memory of a life that had never been hers to keep. The train slowed as it approached the final station. Margaret did not immediately rise. Instead, she let her fingers drift to the small thermos of coffee she'd brought for herself this time. She placed it on the table, and for a brief moment, the car seemed to hold its breath. A sudden gust of wind slipped through the imperfect seal of the window, rattling the cup. Coffee trembled against the lid. The air smelled of metal and wet leaves. And then, the sound. The long, mournful shriek of metal wheels against the track. It echoed through the car, like a farewell, like the sound of something old and patient moving on. Margaret opened her eyes. No one was there. She smiled anyway. That night, she returned home to her quiet house, to the familiar creak of the front step, to the faint ticking of the old wall clock. She removed her scarf and coat, placed her handbag by the door, and poured herself the remainder of the coffee. As she sipped, the house seemed to hold a warmth that hadn't been there for a long time. Not the heat of radiators, but the quiet hum of a heart no longer entirely alone. She didn't need to look in the mirror to know she was smiling. Some journeys never end. They linger in the quiet corners of memory, waiting for the ones who still remember. Margaret's Friday train still runs, through forests and autumn fields, and maybe, if you listen closely, you can still hear two voices sharing a cup of coffee on a nearly empty car. If this story stayed with you, if it touched a memory of someone you've loved and lost, share it with someone who might need that gentle reminder that love doesn't vanish. It just waits, quietly, for us to remember.